Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are positively trying to move and groove into a Sweet 16 and linger longer at the dance. Luke Jones joins us now. All of it brought to you by our friends at Wise Markets. We're going to be talking about eating better and spending less and wise. I think Rob Santoni's going to join me a little later on in the week. We'll be talking about our unique partnership with Wise Markets, and did a little shopping and had a few blueberries and organic strawberries this morning. Luke, the Terps looked like the good Terps on Saturday night, right? And that's what you would want to say against Connecticut. We saw so many teams up and down. I spent half the night with Rutgers on Sunday. They were winning for about 39 and a half minutes and then decided to lose. The Big Ten, it's been a choppy showing thus far, and I don't know a damn thing about Alabama basketball, but I know I want to win.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say more than choppy for the Big Ten when you consider the hype, when you consider the number of teams that made the NCAA tournament. I think it's proving out a little bit that, yes, they had a lot of depth, but maybe it was just depth of solid teams, not necessarily the special. And we'll see. I mean, certainly Maryland, Michigan. I mean, you get through the second round and see who's left, but when you have that many teams enter the tournament and you only have 3 alive going into day 2 of the second round, that's a little disappointing from a conference standpoint. But for Maryland, I think you have to be really pleased with what you saw on Saturday night, despite the fact that they were getting killed on the glass in the first half. I mean, UConn just could not shoot. Maryland defended really well, other than the rebounding aspect, which they did stabilize in the second half. But they played really crisp basketball overall. I mean, we know this team is a flawed team. I mean, they don't have, that traditional point guard. They don't have that Melo Trimble, Anthony Cowan kind of guy at the point. They don't have a true big in the middle. But, this is a team that, for as much criticism as Mark Turgeon has gotten over the years for maybe not living up to expectations or having teams that didn't get better as the season went on, this team clearly improved. Even the Northwestern Penn State losses to close the regular season notwithstanding, this team played a lot better over the last 5 or 6 weeks. And what's been their calling card? Their defense. So when you defend the way that the Terps are able to defend and have defended over the last 5 or 6 weeks, you're going to have a chance most nights. And that's what we've seen. And that certainly proved out against UConn on Saturday night. And when you have Eric Ayala play the way he did, when you have Aaron Wiggins play good basketball, which we've seen much more consistently down the stretch of the season, this team becomes a lot more viable. So it's exciting to see. You get to the second round. I don't think it's as much as I'll look at this thing from a big picture standpoint, I don't think it's something to do cartwheels over, but certainly compared to where this team was 7-8 weeks ago, where we're thinking they weren't going to be an NCAA tournament team, to be in the second round, to have an opportunity to go to the Sweet 16 for only the second time in the Mark Turgeon era. I think this game against Alabama is such a huge, potentially pivotal moment for the Mark Turgeon era, where go back to 2016, the hired gun year, Diamond Stone, Rashid Suleiman, all those guys. They beat a number 12 seed and a number 13 seed to get to the Sweet 16. Can you really look at that, knowing what the expectations were earlier in the season with the collection of talent that they had, and say that that's this overwhelmingly, wildly successful season? I think we all said at the time you were left wanting a little bit. But you beat UConn when you're a 10 seed and they're a 7, and you beat a number 2 seed who Mark Turgeon on Sunday labeled as the, quote, 5th number 1 seed. That's something. That's the kind of momentum building, momentum changing, narrative changing kind of win that, frankly, the Terps just haven't had under Mark Turgeon. So I think this is a huge opportunity, not just to get to a Sweet 16, which is exciting to get to the second weekend every year, but given where this team was, what the expectations were, if Mark Turgeon can lead this group to the Sweet 16, having beaten a number 7 seed and a number 2 seed, and look, the seeds this year, I think it's bearing out. This is a pretty unpredictable tournament, as I think many of us thought it would be. But you beat a number 2 seed and get to the Sweet 16 with this group of kids that didn't have the high expectations. I think that's something that has the potential to change a lot of minds, change a lot of perception about Mark Turgeon as far as the critics of this Maryland basketball program.
Well, the critics are there, right? And you see this Alabama game, then you look over the hill and see what's happening on the other side of the bracket, right? And you start to look at it and say, all right, you want to quiet people? Go to a grade 8, go to a Final Four, win 2 more games here after a decade of never winning this game, right? So there is possibility into next weekend that makes it even more, as Reese's would say, drooling. If you're Maryland, to say this would be a monumental win, right? To take down a 2 seed, right? But more than that, to be in a position to potentially sort of shock the world a little bit, and then that would quiet things for 5 years for Turgeon. Turgeon hadn't had 5 minutes since he's been here, like literally, right? Like, and I'm not pro Turgeon. I don't know Turgeon. I've been in a room with him 10 times at a press conference, maybe ask one question in my life. I don't. I have. I sit on the outside of the Turgeon thing, literally as a conductor in this whole thing. I'm not anti-Turgeon. I'm not pro Turgeon. We didn't have to talk about Maryland coaches here for like as long as I was on the radio, right? As long as Gary was around, it was like, it's kind of like talking about Harbaugh's job. We don't do a whole lot of that over a dozen years. Boy, Turgeon is on, loses a game in November to Broken Pelvis State, then loses a Big Ten game to Iowa in late December or whatever. And, he doesn't make it to New Year's Eve, usually without getting fired by somebody around Christmas time, right? So this happens every year for 10 years. Ever since he's been here, he wasn't ACC, he wasn't Tobacco Road, whatever. He would have a chance here over a week to quell that for a while. I don't know. They go out and lose by 20 points on Monday night to Alabama. It's just, they were 10 seed. It's nice. Go back and it'll all begin again next year. That's how powerful this thing is when you win games this week, right?
Yeah, no question about it. And I'm going to use a very loose example here because they're clearly at different states in the pecking order of their respective leagues, their respective sports. But I kind of look at this as the Ravens being in the divisional round against Buffalo. We had said all along after they lost Ronnie Stanley and they had all the injuries and the COVID outbreak, we had said what? If they'd win a playoff game, that's a successful season. So I think Maryland, having gotten to the second round, given where the expectations were, in looking at 2020/21 in isolation, yeah, successful season, get to the round of 32. You're a number 10 seed, great. But is that doing anything to move the meter for the program in the big picture? No. In the same way that, okay, Lamar Jackson and the Ravens beat Tennessee in the wild card round, that was great. They got that monkey off their back. At the same time, you go to Buffalo and you score 3 points. Well, we see how this
Can I
offseason is
ask you what
perceived.
moving the program forward in the big picture would mean? Does that mean if they win on Monday night, they sell more tickets? Does that mean they get more sponsorships? Does that mean that some kid who would go to Kentucky is going to go to Maryland instead for 6 months? Because that's sort of what you're asking, right? Like if you're asking for that next tier kid, they had that kid, Diamond Stone, Suleiman. They rented kids, right? Now they got guys like Ayala, who feels like he's been here since Benny Ayala was here, quite frankly, right? And Wiggins feels like he's been here since the other Wig. Like literally, these guys feel like they've been here a long time per Maryland stays. I mean, longer than Herder, longer than some of these guys that blink, and you got 2 years in them, one if they're really good, right? And they don't have a big man. We talk about rebounding and all that. So, tomorrow morning when they lose by 12 points, like they probably should, we would talk about the deficiencies they have, and you would go back and say, well, if they move the program forward, they'd have a big man. They'd have I don't know. I don't really understand modern college basketball in that way because everything's so arbitrary. From 1 minute Styx is playing over in West Baltimore, and the next minute there's a plague and he's gone, to, hey, Morcell's still out there dribbling, and he was kind of a big deal, and he stuck around. And wouldn't it be nice if he was the magic carpet ride guy like Juan Dixon and Steve Blake and those guys were, to go on a little bit of a miraculous ride for the first time in literally 20 years. It's been 20 years, man. Right?
Yeah. I mean, it has been. And I mean, look, all those things that you just mentioned are part of it. And I think a lot of this is think we've seen a lot of apathy from Maryland basketball
Fair
in
enough.
recent
I'll give you
years.
that. You want
And
people
that's
to
not,
buy back in. I
yeah,
get it.
yeah. I mean, and now, does that mean someone is barely paying attention and then they're going to buy season tickets down at Xfinity Center and make the trip to College Park on a Tuesday night for a 7 o'clock tip, which traffic's a nightmare under normal conditions? No, not necessarily. But you start building to that a little bit more. I
Well,
think
you give
people,
everybody a moment on Thursday or Friday night, right?
right?
I mean, you give everybody a moment where they're playing Abilene Christian or UCLA, and it's a memorable night of Maryland basketball. The way every Duke and Carolina game was, right? Like we can't say that the world stops for a Michigan State game or an Ohio State game. Ohio State,
Yeah,
Illinois, right? I mean, go on, but and you have to make fun of them, right? If you don't start to hate them, what do we got? If you don't
right.
really dislike, if you're not excited about Ohio State going out in the middle of the night, then you haven't gotten your ass kicked by them in football enough, probably, right?
Yeah, really. Although I must say, since you mentioned Ohio State, I did see the best tweet of the weekend was Oral Roberts has more wins over Ohio State than Jim Harbaugh, which was
Love
just
it.
perfect, just perfect. But getting back to your question and what we were just talking about, I think it's for a lot of Maryland fans, and look, this even started on the back end of Gary Williams' tenure. I mean, let's be honest. When they win the national championship in '02, they get to the Sweet 16 in '03. Steve Blake misses the shot against Michigan State. That era officially comes to an end with that. The '03 team certainly wasn't as good as '02, but certainly had their moments, and they make it to the Sweet 16. But I think we all, or at least I did, as in my late teens, early 20s, as a Maryland basketball fan, having seen what Gary had done post sanctions and with Joe Smith and Keith Booth and just building and that team making so many Sweet 16s, and it took him a while to break through from that level, of course. And there were plenty of questions whether Gary Williams could do that, but once they got to the Final Four in
That was only
'01,
the first 10 years of my career. This
right,
is the
right,
30th year. The first 10 years is Gary can't win the big one. Gary
sure.
can't recruit. Gary doesn't pay the kids enough. Gary doesn't get enough local kids, right? Like literally that's
Right.
what
Oh,
we
yeah.
live with, right?
Well, and to be very clear, when I've talked about expectations under Mark Turgeon, I'm not at all saying that Maryland becomes the best program in the country and they're winning, they're in the Final Four every other year. But I guess as a Maryland fan who's seen them reach the top of the mountain, I don't want to give up on the idea that that's not possible to happen again. And look, I don't know if it can
Like
happen
they have
again.
at Georgetown.
Right, right. Well, I mean, look at lots of different programs over, you look over decades of time, you think of teams that are a powerhouse
Well,
30
dude,
years
I'm
ago
watching
that,
Houston play Rutgers in the middle of the night, thinking, who the hell is Rutgers? And I'm thinking about back in the day and Akeem the Dream and all of
yeah,
that, right? And you're
sure.
thinking, man, that's a program they got down there in Houston, like Georgetown, right?
Right, right. So I think if Maryland can beat Alabama, and to your point, you think of Alabama as this basketball school, though, give them a lot of credit. They run, they shoot threes. I mean, this is going to be a big test for Maryland. Even Maryland's defense. I mean, this is a really fast, athletic, high tempo, 3-point shooting kind of team, and they like to get out and run and play in transition. So, Maryland likes to be a little more methodical than maybe some of Turgeon's teams of the past. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But just getting back to that big picture concept, people that have defended Mark Turgeon, what he's done elsewhere. And look, I've never said Mark Turgeon's a terrible coach. Let's be very clear about at least what I think are fair criticisms of him. It's wondering, is this it? When you've had one Sweet 16 in your first decade as Maryland coach going into Monday night's game, of course, and even when you did that, there was a bunch of hired guns. There were high expectations. There was a team that many people thought was going to be a top 5, Final Four kind of team. You got to the Sweet 16, but you beat South Dakota State and Hawaii to do it. So, it's not like it was any great path that they had that they took down a juggernaut along the way. So for people that have defended Turgeon, I've heard some even say, well, Maryland basketball fans' expectations are too high. And I've even, I think with Scott Van Pelt, and I think I mentioned this to you last week, even made the comparison to someone like Tennessee in football, where you think of T. Martin and post Peyton Manning, they win a national championship. But does anyone view Tennessee in the way they did 20, 25 years ago when Phil Fulmer was their coach and they won it all the year after Peyton went to the NFL? No. So I'll fully acknowledge maybe Maryland can't be that national championship contending kind of program anymore. At the same time, if that is the case, I'd like to find out with at least one other coach where it's, you're looking at what Mark Turgeon's done. All right, they've made NCAA tournaments and they haven't had these lousy seasons where in the bottom two in the conference or anything disastrous like that, but it hasn't been anything overly special. It hasn't been anything memorable. So even if they can't be that elite program, they can't be a team that gets back to a Final Four one day, I'd still like to find out if with someone else. You're telling me you can't get someone as good as Mark Turgeon if you do have to make that call at some point in time. So that's kind of been my argument against that. However, bringing it back to Mark Turgeon, bringing it back to the 2021 team, if you can get to the Sweet 16 and you beat a number 2 seed, regardless of how good these number 1 seeds are, other than, I think Gonzaga and Baylor, everyone else. I mean, we saw what happened to Illinois, and they were a team I thought could win the national title, and they're out in the second round. So kind of shows the volatility of this year. But you get back to a Sweet 16, and then at that point, to me, you're playing with house money. Yes, you'd love to see what the matchup is in the next round, and sure, maybe you can get to the Elite Eight, and that'd be amazing. I mean, that would truly be an amazing accomplishment for where this team was 2 months ago. But just getting to that round of 16, I feel like it almost puts you, from a fan mindset, puts you back on a path of where Maryland was, say, in the mid 90s, where, okay, they had the Joe Smith freshman year team where, they were a 10 seed that year, I believe, and they get to the Sweet 16. And suddenly you're starting to think, all right, this is plausible again. This is an opportunity to build some momentum. And if it can be done with this team that doesn't have an abundance of blue chip talent, but Mark Turgeon coached these guys up and they play the defense the way they do, that's where I think you start creating some optimism. Not that it's Mark Turgeon gets a free pass for the next 10 years automatically after that, but I think for critics who have wanted to see this program move forward under him, this one would certainly carry more clout than the 2016 team beating Hawaii in the second round and you get to the Sweet 16 then and you lose to Kansas. So I think from that standpoint, I feel like this game can be such a big narrative. I don't want to say change, but it allows the narrative to start to potentially shift. And I think it's, you have some good recruiting classes the next couple years. Get back to another Sweet 16. Maybe 2 years from now, you're in an Elite Eight, let's say. Then okay, you feel like you're moving back in a direction of where Maryland was, at least in the late 90s, right? I mean, it's not like they got to a bunch of Final Fours, and had all these failures in the
Yeah, but
final
they got to
weekend.
play Rex Chapman.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? They got to play in 16s
sure.
frequently, and I remember every one of them. And my friends Rob DeBilius and Greg Kinser and Joe Elliott all getting together and throwing parties on Kane Street. Like literally, I remember those events. Like you remember the Maryland Connecticut game that you witnessed, right? Like
Sure.
I remember that lonely road with Steve Francis driving back from Knoxville, Tennessee, and I remember what it looked like when Joe Smith hit his spine about 12 feet in front of me on the court out in Oakland. Feels like a minute ago. It was 28 years ago. I remember what it was like being at the Georgia Dome, and watching the seconds tick down as they're beating Kansas to go to the national championship. All of that. I haven't had a Maryland moment like that in a long time, right? So whatever it is, whether it's a Morcell buzzer beater or a, Wiggins free throw or whatever happens to beat Alabama, it would be a very memorable moment in the annals of Maryland basketball of the like that we really haven't had in the Big Ten era, right? Like literally the Big Ten era, the Turgeon era, my dude Bino, the whole era, right? Trimble, go back through all of this, right? That not since like I guess a Vasquez era,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or it's certainly not an ACC Garyland era. Would there be a magic moment in Maryland basketball history? I guess that's what we're really talking about here. Name the most famous moment of the Turgeon era. I don't know. Mask on and hand slapping guys on Saturday? Maybe, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just laid it out, though. I think it's Maryland basketball fans who haven't been happy with Mark Turgeon don't think Mark Turgeon's the worst coach in college basketball or anything like that. It's not over the top. And I say this because this is how I feel, quite frankly. I consider myself in that group. I want to
You've
be able
gotten in
to.
your car on 21-degree nights and driven to
Sure.
College Park from Shrewsbury.
Sure,
Correct?
sure. But
Yeah.
but but I want to believe that that's plausible again. But that feeling, those feelings you just laid out from circa 1994, and we all think of Joe Smith and Keith Booth and beating Georgetown at the Capitol Center, and going to the Sweet 16 that first year, and
Luke,
then
I want to get on a plane next week and fly to Indiana to see them play Abilene. You know what I mean? I
right,
want to make a night. I want to be at a party. I want to wear my Lamont Jordan. I want to do all of that. Give me a reason. It's like the
right,
Orioles. Give me a reason.
sure. And I think, and even in that era from 95 through 2005, and then kind of the last gasp for Gary Williams' program truly being, elite, or at least on that the cusp of that, the Vasquez team, the 2010 team, of course, and Vasquez, his heroics, and Corey Lucius breaking their heart in the second round. But just to have that belief at that point in time, you believe that a Final Four was possible. You believe that a national championship was possible, and they weren't a top 5 team every year in that era. They had their moments, certainly, and of course you got the 2001, 2002. Then they got there, but they weren't a top 5 perfect team every year over that decade or so. But you felt, because they got to so many Sweet 16s, that there was some potential there. I mean, I don't. Let's be very clear. If Maryland beats Alabama, I'm still not believing they're going to the Final Four. But you start to think, if you can get to the Sweet 16 with this team and where they were at one point in the season, and all the challenges they had, and the fact that they lost their 2 best players last year coming into this weird pandemic season, it opens up your imagination a little bit more moving forward. It opens up the possibilities again. And I think, again, you don't want apathy, you want hope. And I think there's been a lack of real hope for a lot of fans, in this Maryland program, just looking at it, thinking that, it feels so far away, those visions and daydreams of the Final Four. And okay, I mean, the 2016 team, you felt it a little bit just because they were hyped so much, but by the end of that season, you weren't feeling it as much, and it just, you felt more disappointed because they didn't play as well down the stretch compared to what the expectations were to start the season. So, if you can get to that same stage, meaning a Sweet 16 with this team, and knowing that it's not a bunch of hired guns or anything like that, it was, just program guys, really. A couple, some transfers and things of that nature, which you have most years. I mean, Ryan Randall, when you think back to guys that Maryland had way back when, that transfers and JUCO guys and things of that nature. So you have that. But, if Turgeon can get this team to the second weekend, considering where they were, again, it doesn't make me feel like, oh, okay, next year, Final Four. But it feels, from a long-term perspective, you've accomplished something. You've beaten a number 2 seed in the second round, which is something that a Mark Turgeon team cannot claim having done at any point over the last decade in the NCAA tournament, knowing they haven't been all that good in the Big Ten tournament either. If we're just looking at postseason, it's a feather in the cap, and it's something to build upon. So for me, that's where I look at this Monday night showdown in the round of 32, where it feels like it could be, a momentum shift, a narrative shift a little bit. It feels like people who haven't believed in Mark Turgeon for several years now and say, hey, you know what? He's done a really nice job with this program, and he has. He's done a nice job with this team, this specific team, with where they were and the challenges they had early in the season, and the fact that they struggled to score on offense, and they had their scoring droughts. I mean, they had a scoring drought in the second half on Saturday night, but they weathered it. They played really mature basketball over that stretch. I mean, look what happened late in the first half when Ayala goes to the bench after the monster first half performance. They're up 9. That was just outside the under 4 media timeout, and they didn't wither. They didn't lose the lead. I mean, they
play defense,
right?
If
Exactly.
they just rebound, you talk about not having a big man, right? Like,
if they rebound, I mean, they win.
When they're losing the boards, you just feel like they need a Bruno. They need a
Sure.
big guy in order to really win. I don't know. I mean, we're talking about Alabama here, right? Like, I don't know much about Alabama. I know we haven't played them in football since 1953.
That's a
I
good
know
thing.
that I did look it up, and I'm like, man, was there a Wimp Sanderson visit back in the 80s or something? Something I don't remember. And apparently they played like an NIT game in 2013. They played on March 26th
Yeah.
in 2013. So that tells me that was in the not in tournament, probably. That late into March in 2013. I'm thinking, where the hell was I? I was celebrating the Ravens' Super Bowl victory. I was writing a book. That's why I didn't notice. But I mean, Maryland versus Alabama, just seeing that on a bracket, I looked at it and I'm like, that's weird. Really weird.
It definitely. Well, I mean, just the Crimson Tide being a number 2 seed. I mean, that's odd. I mean, to
Well,
your
this is the
point,
best part. You beat them, you piss off Nick Saban and everybody he brings to the party. So good. Let's go win for that alone. We got a way better chance. If you give me a chance of beating him at basketball or beating him at football, I'm taking my chances on the hardwood Monday night.
no question. You make Mike Loxley happy coming from Alabama back to Maryland. I mean, yeah, I mean, everyone's feeling good. Like I said, I mean, I feel
You'll
like
never
this,
beat him at football. This is the one chance.
again, I don't want to make too much of this in the context of the entire program's history, but in the context of the Mark Turgeon era, I feel this is such a huge opportunity for him to kind of say, okay, we did this. This isn't the, I don't view this as being the pinnacle, and I don't want this to be viewed as the pinnacle. The Sweet 16, that's part of my issue. That's been part of my problem. I don't want it to feel like the Sweet 16 is the best they can ever do ever again. I want to feel like a national championship at some point can happen again. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed that it will. I don't want to sit here and say that I expect Maryland to be in the Final Four every year. I want to be able to think that they can have a successful enough program where that's plausible every X number of years. And Gary Williams proved that that was possible here, in College Park. So, that's where I think, it's just you beat Alabama, regardless of what happens after that. And as you pointed out, I mean, you could have a pretty decent draw in the Sweet 16 there if you get through. But it just feels I don't want to say, again, vindication, because it doesn't feel like Mark Turgeon just gets a pass for a decade then, but you get to a Sweet 16 with this group, having beaten a number 2 seed in the second round. It feels like that's something you can build on. That's something that you can start to get some people back. You can start getting some eyeballs back on your program. To your point, you mentioned that 2013 NIT team. Why would you pay attention? It's the NIT. I mean, I'm not being mean, but when you're a
It
program
was
that's one,
late March. I was boning up on my Orioles program that
yeah,
year. You know what
yeah.
I mean? I was celebrating a Ravens champ. I was waiting for the Caps to win a cup. I mean, there's a million things going on that were not involving me watching NIT basketball on March 26, 2013.
Why would you? I mean, that's just the truth. When you've been to the top of the mountain, it's the same. You mentioned the Caps. The Caps win the Stanley Cup. No one cares about the President's Trophy anymore. I mean, you do in the sense of at that moment in time, but it doesn't. It's not as viewed as special of an accomplishment then when you've been to the top of the
Yeah, they're
mountain.
telling me
That's my point.
Ovechkin's having a hell of a year right now. I wouldn't know, but wake me in June if they're still playing. The
Yeah,
Caps have had a representative season. If they go out in April, it wasn't a good year.
right. And I mean, but part of this is, yeah, you do. Fair or not, you do become a victim of your own success. I mean, the Ravens deal with this, right? I mean, they've made the playoffs 3 straight years. Look how many games they've won in the regular season, and yet right now, and look, I'm not saying people should be panicked or have a right to be overly angry or anything like that, but there are questions of how do you get to the next, how do you take the next step in January, and that's a fair grounded assessment. So that's what happens though when you win Super Bowls, when you win national championships as Maryland did, even if it was 19 years ago, your fan base wants to believe that can happen again. And over 10 years with Mark Turgeon, one Sweet 16 with a hired gun team, and they beat a 12 and a 13 seed. That's not something you write a book on, and that's something you can appreciate certainly. So I don't know if getting to the Sweet 16, beating Alabama warrants writing a book, but it feels like it's a very meaningful step in the right direction for the Mark Turgeon era of the Terps, and hoping you can maybe one day get back to a Final Four, whether next year, 5 years from now, whatever it is, it's
You get to
something
the
that
Final
matters.
Four next weekend if you win tonight, period. This is the time of the
Fair.
year that happens. This.
Of
And by
course.
the way, if they lose to UCLA, you can say we got knocked out by UCLA, but don't say you lost to an SEC team on a Monday night in March. Luke Jones, you can find him at Baltimore Luke and Luke at WNST.net. We're going to be around all week, changing a lot of stuff, getting you ready for baseball season. I'm bringing a lot of baseball experts. Going to have some good visits here this week into next week, as well as some classic content. All of it brought to you by our friends at Wise Markets. We're going to be telling you more about making wise choices. I made a wise choice, and I actually shopped at the Wise that used to be the Mars, across from what used to be the barn on Harford Road. So how about that? Harford and Joppa, my old stomping grounds. I picked up my fresh fruit over the weekend. Also got like a lemon herb pork that was like, wow, man, I grilled that up on Sunday night. It was delicious. Big appreciation to Wise Markets. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Terps and Baltimore Positive.